Thanks a lot, Deepan. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. I thought I'd start off with just a few statistics. 46% of corporate networks incurred intrusion attempts related to Log4j. 3 million attempts to exploit the vulnerability were made before Christmas in December. 60 variations of the original Log4j exploit were introduced in 24 hours, and over 7,000 open source projects rely on Log4j as a dependency. The fun fact is that Log4j is so common, it's been included as a building block in the helicopter aboard the Mars rover, which tells you how ubiquitous it is. And it also tells you the scope of the attack surface even is beyond our planet, which is quite an amazing thing. So with that, I'd like to introduce and invite Alex Phillips, CIO of NOV, and Sean Cordero, the Zscaler CISO for the Americas, to join us on the virtual stage. Alex, maybe you could just introduce yourself quickly and tell us a little bit about NOV.
Sure, Andy, thank you. My name's Alex Phillips, CIO for NOV, and NOV is a company behind the scenes in the energy market, and that could be the search for hydrocarbons or even our renewables. And so not many people know about us, but we're in the background, and it's an important industry as we all kind of love energy.
Excellent. Thanks, Alex. Sean, would you like to introduce yourself too?
Hi, yes, thank you for having me here today. My name is Sean Cordero. I'm the CISO for the Americas at Zscaler. Before Zscaler, I spent quite some time working in the cybersecurity research space, specifically on the definition of cloud controls and advising many of the Fortune 100 on their cybersecurity programs.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So we're going to talk really about communications and how to keep your board engaged in our session this morning. It's quite coincidental that Deepan and I happened to be in the Zscaler board yesterday, where obviously this was a big topic of interest, both in December and yesterday. Why don't we start off with Alex? You know, when you think about what is fundamentally different communicating with the board as opposed to your peers or even your senior executives, how do you think about that and how do you do it?
Yeah, the board's interesting when you think about how it's different. A lot of times when you're discussing with your peers, they can't fire you, where the board can fire you. So I always think about that. But boards are made up of different individuals, and not all of them understand technology. And so it's on our shoulders to make sure that we express the language in a risk that they can understand, and also how it impacts the company. Sometimes it's such that they understand what's going on and they understand the risk. And sometimes it's not. And so when Log4j, it was one of those where it's like, okay, this is one of those that I definitely need to notify senior management, my boss, who's the CEO and chairman of the board, and then kind of understand, is this one of those things that we do need to notify the full board on, or is that enough? And so it is a challenge to understand your board, and I think the key there is to understand your board members. Some of your board members are highly technical, and they get it and they understand it and they want to hear more. Some of the other board members are not. Their expertise could be in finance or other areas, and what they really want to understand is, Alex, what's the risk and how are you addressing it?
Excellent. I think maybe Deepan, you could just add to that somewhat, just given that we've set up a risk committee in our own board, which has oversight over all of security. How important do you think that is? And kind of from your perspective on Log4j, how important was it to have the board engaged?
Yeah, I think the risk committee part is extremely important. I mean, you shouldn't be communicating with the board, or you shouldn't have that connect with board just at the times when the crisis happen, right? It should be a continuous engagement. Now, you don't want to overdo it in terms of information overload. So that's where having a committee where you have one or two people appointed from the board to work with the risk working group, right? Or whether it's CISO, the IT folks, cross-functional leaders meeting regularly to assess how are we doing in terms of improving our security posture. Are we prepared to respond to some of these attacks? And then whenever there is an incident, even if you're not impacted, sending that initial message out to that risk committee really helps out. And then when you have these board meetings, a lot of the information is already available to the broader board members.
Yeah, totally. I think policy is super important as well. So understanding what the escalation path is and under what circumstance, I think, is super important. So, Alex, again, go ahead, Sean. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I was going to say on Deepan's point, something that brings me back was the very first time I ever had the opportunity to engage the board of directors. And sadly, it wasn't one of these situations where it was a good situation. It was a getting called to task because my team that I had just joined and inherited had never been given the support necessary to execute a full-blown disaster recovery plan. And now we had regulators breathing down our neck saying, why isn't this done? Why isn't this done? And we ended up getting a nice invitation to go and present and explain ourselves to the board of directors. One of the scariest things that ever happened in my career turned out to be not as bad as I had thought, but to Deepan's point, there weren't the mechanisms in place, the processes nor the communication strategies to prevent the organization leadership and the governance bodies from getting blindsided. So I can't stress how important that is.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I think although experience is the teacher of all things, many board members have never actually been in a position where they've had to deal with something like this. And, having worked through hundreds of these in my career, I mean, Melissa, I Love You and SQL Slammer actually left scars on my back, to be honest, but the rest are the rest were less serious. But SQL Slammer and Log4j actually are quite similar in a way, and just in terms of the impact and the scope. It's pretty much the entire internet and the entire corporate network with SQL Slammer, and that's like a very hard thing to start to figure out how to deal with. So I definitely empathize, and at least there's one board member anyway who gets the pain. So I definitely empathize with you on that. Alex, when you think about how you empower or partner your CISO peers or ensure a meaningful communication happening to the board, is there any advice you might give someone who hasn't got board access and might be a CISO listening on the call today?
Yeah, I think it's kind of what Deepan said earlier about zero trust. It's a journey to get there. And in my case, it was very similar. It was one of those, like Sean mentioned, hey, come present to the board and tell the board everything that you're doing. And that happened about once every other year. And then slowly over time, as the board members started understanding this was a greater risk and something that it was their responsibility to kind of watch over, it started to be more often. And then it was, okay, you're going to have a quarterly, every board meeting, you've got a slide talking about risk and what we've seen and what we're doing. And then it's, hey, you're a main presenter in one of the board meetings, quarterly. And so it's a journey. And if you don't have access today, don't just sit on your hands, go ahead and start. The end goal is that you're updating on risk. So start doing that with your bosses and see how far up the chain you can go, right? Can you go all the way up to, the CEO and the executives in your company? And so you start enabling them and helping them understand the risk. And as board members ask them questions, they will feel more comfortable that you're the expert. I need you to inform the board. So it's a journey. It was telling for me when my CEO, who is a trained engineer, wonderful, great man, he's my boss. And when we were discussing some risk around software and the supply chain and stuff like that, and us being a manufacturing and mostly services company, he had the epiphany that all companies are software companies, whether they realize it or not. Exactly. And that was the point that I went, he's starting to get it. He understands. And it's a journey. You don't just instantly get there.
I agree. Deepan, you must have seen this practice across many client companies and talked to many CISOs about it as well. I'm sure Sean has too. What have you got any advice you'd like to pass on? You're muted.
It happens always. So yeah, I mean, adding to what Alex mentioned, right? It's a journey, and then you need to do certain things yourself, right? You need to start somewhere. The part that has always worked very well on our side, for instance, is having a proper, detailed crisis management plan, right? And your crisis management
100%.
plan should it should cover things like operational resiliency, business continuity, disaster recovery, security incident response. Having those building blocks in place will let you trigger your crisis management plan. So in case of Zscaler, for instance, the way we have done it is any incident or series of events or things like even Log4j, right? When that happens, anything that has potential to have adverse effects on Zscaler, whether internally or externally, if it impacts our employees, operations, services, customers, right? Anything that can result in impacting the reputation as well will result in us triggering that plan. And we'll notify board, we'll notify senior leadership, and there is a group that gets together, and then we have a escalation bridge that basically results in us responding to those things. But the important point over there is to have that clear communication guideline and informing all the parties involved, right, of what's happening, why you are being notified about this, and how well are we communicating with even our customers in these kind of scenarios is extremely important.
Agreed. Do you want to add anything to that, Sean?
Yeah, I think so. I've seen this a lot in organizations where the organizational structure is still a little legacy driven. In other words, where you have a CTO or CIO and the CISO lives somewhere underneath him or her. And I call that legacy because it used to be in many organizations that you don't want to expose or share anything that might put the IT function or the technology function in a potentially bad light. And this has been a push and pull situation across many different organizations. I've seen it in governmental ones, where it's a chain of command thing. I've seen it in public organizations and private organizations as well. And it's simply a dynamic that is very human, where we don't want to necessarily raise a concern that's going to expose the leadership, yet at the same time, part of our charter as security professionals is to raise concerns that might expose the leadership. It's a matter of how you go about it and finding partnership across the organization. So Deepan mentioned putting in place committees or groups where the power of the larger organization and the good that can be done through those groups not only can help insulate you as the security leader, but also provide that visibility necessary to reach across the aisle literally and figuratively. In addition, there's other two areas that, depending upon the structure of the organization, should be considered. Number one is your finance organization. They have a very clear charter in terms of protecting both the P&L, but at the same time ensuring that there isn't any undue loss associated with the operations of the business. And by engaging with them sooner rather than later and learning how they communicate loss and what matters to them, you might be able to start building allies associated with getting your messaging across. And then finally, where you have organizations that have for example, in insurance, you see this a lot, or in healthcare, you have a chief risk officer that has usually a very narrow but very powerful responsibility of managing overall risk, which often does not include cyber, to engage them as well in these discussions soon and find ways to communicate and articulate the risks associated with what it is that we do every day.
Agreed. I mean, I think the thing that I would advise a CISO in that position to do personally is to understand the structure of the organization, understand where risks are raised to the board. And it's nearly always the audit committee. I mean, people call it the audit committee, but technically speaking, it's usually the audit and risk committee. And if there is a head of risk, they're normally a member of that committee. So I think understanding the path for risk escalation in your company is a very important thing for a CISO to do, particularly if they're inside a tech organization, not actually also co-reporting into a risk organization. So starting to build that channel of communication in the language of the business, right, is really important to do. So understanding what this cyber risk can do to your business, I think, has come home to roost with ransomware, because it's just so in your face, you can't ignore it. But many of the other things can be as bad as that and are not really necessarily surfaced in the same way to board members. We have a question from Sanjay Gupta, which is that technology folks understand the concept, it's a journey. For non-technical board members, it usually implies we need more money and can't tell you when we're going to get to the destination. And I think many folks who are running a more traditional architecture, a castle and moat architecture or hub and spoke architecture, are probably challenged by how to start that process. You know, having run a number of network transformations in extremely difficult organizations to run those in financial services, I obviously have a point of view on that myself. But maybe Deepan, what do you think the best practices are for a CISO that knows they need to drive change, knows it's going to take money to drive the change, but wants to get to that place where zero trust lets them sleep at nights? What's the best place to start?
Yeah, I would highly recommend starting with your crown jewel applications, right? And I agree. I mean, the technology part, a lot of the folks will get it. But with the non-tech folks, you're talking dollars, and you're saying, hey, it's a journey, but they believe in the target date. When are you going to get there, right? So start with the crown jewel applications. That's where the two tenets that I mentioned, eliminate your external attack surface. When you do that, you will also be able to remove a lot of those legacy technologies that you're paying, large dollars for, right? Whether it's those DOS protections or even VPN technology, right? All of those things can be replaced when you adopt that zero trust architecture to safeguard your business critical applications, which is what I'm referring to as crown jewels. That's where I would start, and then next, my goal will be to make sure all my user assets are protected. And the goal is not to, again, rely on that castle and moat architecture where I'm backhauling my users' traffic to a network and then applying security over there. The goal is, again, to rely on something that allows me to apply that consistently, no matter where the user is. And by doing that, and I'm referring to a cloud native proxy based architecture, a SaaS offering, by doing that, I am again eliminating a lot of those boxes and point technologies that I've built over time inside my corporate network, right? So it will be incremental gains, but you will be able to qualify, right? Hey, here I got rid of all of this, and now I'm using this, and my risks reduce from where it was before to here. Hey, I don't need to patch within 3 hours. You should still patch, but you have that safety net because now your assets are not exposed to the external world, or you're able to apply consistent security to all your devices.
That's a great answer. I think the one thing that I might add to that is that, after 9/11, I rebuilt a global network in 6 days from scratch with one of the best teams I've ever worked with. And when there's no politics, you can get things done extremely quickly. Maybe Sean, could you talk to what's happened during COVID, where organizations realized, oh hell, we don't have anywhere near enough remote bandwidth to deal with our remote workers, and our VPNs can't cope. We've seen companies deploy ZPA in a weekend, and taking that risk actually has decreased their overall risk surface. I don't advise that at this stage in the COVID iteration, but the fact that we did it successfully with many large companies, I think is a testament actually to both our platform and our go-to-market engagement for execution. Just give the audience a sense as to what kind of things happened during COVID with that rapid adoption and what benefits some of those companies got.
So the COVID situation, which we still are in the pandemic, and we're still dealing with the ramifications of of bad decisions in some cases that were made during that time. And truth be told, many organizations that were either in the early stages of transformation, either to adopting zero trust or on the road of a security transformation journey, those organizations either accelerated that very quickly or had to put that to the side and focus solely on what they had in place. What that has now created is a lot of sunk cost in those organizations where they ended up doubling down on what they already had in place. For example, legacy VPN, that type of technology. And this has led to an extension of this method of connectivity. Now, on the other side, you have organizations that look at it, given the seriousness of it, as an opportunity, trying to look at the positive of what could come from something as horrible as the COVID pandemic, and decided to use this as a way to accelerate their transformation, not only making a very simple business case, which is we need people to work remotely, don't we? And utilize this as the inflection point for getting not just the resourcing and the support to be able to get in place the necessary technology. Now, I wanted to touch upon something that Deepan had just said, which was regarding, and specifically off of what Mr. Gupta had asked just a few minutes ago, which is when you are going down this path and you're having difficulty getting the appropriate level of support, whether it's from your infrastructure team or in some cases your security team. This, what is very, very well known now and has been shown over and over again, is that there are certain technical controls that have been in place for many, many years now. For example, traditional, even next generation firewalls, these types of technologies that are either virtualized in the cloud or living on premises that are just not effective. Now, why this matters is in the context of business risk management. What I suggest to any security professional or infrastructure professional or even application professional that is trying to drive transformation in the organization, but is getting into these types of battles with one of the other stakeholder groups, what I suggest to them is go through the risk management process. If you have one, which I hope you do, get the risk committees involved and have those teams own the risk. Show the deficiencies, show the weakness and the exposure that you are putting on your business. And I guarantee you that not only will you probably create a couple of enemies, but they probably didn't like you to begin with, but on top of which, you're going to be doing the best thing you can for your organization by exposing what is the reality, which is the way that we've done it over the last 25 years is a failure. It never worked. And we have to stop pretending that it has. If it had, we wouldn't be having this conversation.
Perfect, thanks a lot. There's another very good question actually from the Q&A that I'd like to bring in, which is how can Zscaler help board and audit committee members ask the right questions to management? And are there any thoughts on educating non-technical board members on the minimum knowledge of the benefits of zero trust? And again, you know, if you think about technology architecture, many board members are not versed in technology architecture at all and need an analogy to help them understand what it is that zero trust brings that previous architectures do not. Alex, when you started to present internally inside NOV to your CEO and your board, how did you explain it? How did you explain what zero trust brings? I know Deepan's got a good answer for this, and I do too, but I'd love to hear how you did it first, if that's okay. You're on mute, Alex, sorry.
Sorry about that. I was muted.
Not worry.
I got it too, Deepan. Sorry about that. Yeah, ours was interesting. The zero trust was something we were kicking around before COVID hit, and we had already gone to a zero trust network access model, which to our employees was just, oh, this is a different VPN. So you really didn't have to educate them on, no, you're not really on the network. You're actually going through a proxy. And so as we started down the journey of education, it became a little easier because we were able to say, hey, do you remember when everyone was working from home except the manufacturing plants and it just worked? Well, that's what we want to do for all of our facilities too. And that's how we're going to bring the next level of security. And then last fall, when I presented to our board and ransomware had just hit a company in the energy space, Colonial Pipeline, and there were a lot of questions about that. Are we going to suffer from the same thing? How do we not have that problem? And so being able to bring up zero trust as this is our journey, this is how we start to address those type of risks, it's one component of it, was very, very beneficial. And then while I'm not a huge fan of presidential directives or executive orders, they go all the way back to President Reagan when it comes to cybersecurity. Biden's executive order directly mentions zero trust. And so being able to use that to inform the board that this is real, this is a direction that we all know we need to go. And look, even the president of the United States has said that zero trust is the direction we must go. And so that was part of my education journey on how do I get them to understand what is zero trust, why is it important? It's not something I made up. It's not me saying I need bazillions of dollars. This is the future, we need to do it.
So to Helmuth's question, actually one of the things that board members can do is say, if the government is actually mandating zero trust on their own organizations, why isn't it the right thing for us to do? So hopefully that's a direct answer, Helmuth. But I'm going to let Deepan answer, because I think sometimes with board members, it's helpful to have some kind of analogy. So we don't necessarily have to explain it in terms of technology. And our CEO has a very good story that he uses about access to buildings. So maybe I'll just give you a quick go at answering that before we get to the next question, Deepan.
Sure. Yeah. So explaining zero trust in a simple terms, like Andy mentioned, our CEO uses this all the time. When you have a visitor visiting your office building, right, and he's trying to attend a meeting in a very specific room, if you let the visitor in the lobby, you authenticate him, right? You know that this guy is expected for this meeting, and you let him through. He could wander around to any of those meeting rooms, right? So that is basically similar to you using VPN to authenticate a user. You know this user is a known person, and then you're assigning them an IP address. Now they can wander around in your environment. Instead, if you adopt zero trust, you will authenticate the user in the lobby, and then you will take the user to a very specific room where that user has business to do, right? So thinking from the technology side, a user that is trying to access an application should only be allowed to access that application. The user should not be brought on the same network as the application. That's a very simplified version of how you should think about when you're implementing zero trust. You're trying to eliminate those flat networks. You're trying to reduce that blast radius from an infected host. And by the way, we actually also wrote an ebook. So I'll share that in the chat, where we're trying to simplify many of these key fundamentals of zero trust. Because yes, there was a executive order, which is great. Everyone realizes that they need to do zero trust, but it has also resulted in a lot of noise, right? Where every vendor claims to do zero trust, even when they have nothing to do with the core inspection architecture. So that book is really helpful. We will share the link in the chat.
Awesome. Okay, let's jump to Sean. Communication frameworks are so important for these conversations with teams that are working really hard, and the executives and the board. After 9/11, there were no separated out-of-band communication networks, and unbelievably, AOL Messenger ended up being the mechanism that most people use to communicate. So I have a lot of familiarity with this particular problem. What learnings have you got around putting together board communication frameworks? and automatic calling, robocalling, WhatsApp, tabletop exercises, getting folks engaged. I mean, what do you think the best practices look like there?
I could give you three that I believe are really part and parcel of any successful communication plan. And a lot of it is taking a page from professional communicators, kind of like marketers. One is you want to be front and center as much as possible. So what this looks like is ensuring that you have executive level outreach that is intended to put forth the positives and the accomplishments that are being achieved by a security program, yet at the same time balancing this with the realities of what you might be dealing with on the day-to-day basis. So that might be making them aware of today Log4j came out and here is our stance on it. Often what happens is a communication gets stuck solely within the realm of, let's say, IT and never makes it out until perhaps a audit committee member asks or a risk committee member asks, and usually it starts and stops there. There's no reason that it can't be a broader communication to let all of your other business stakeholders be aware that you and the security team are on top of it. That's one thing. The second thing I would suggest is ensuring that your communications are titrated appropriately for that level of audience. As what was said earlier, not all board members necessarily carry the exact same experience, nor are all of them technical. So what this means is that we have to adjust our communication style and the level of communication to that particular audience. If they don't understand it, it is not their problem. It is our problem. And we must own that and learn better ways to continue that dialogue with them, or even to start a dialogue in language that makes sense. And then third is frequency. If the communications are as inconsistent as my hairline, what I assure you will happen is that they will forget. And the only times that you will find that you're getting engaged is when something big and negative happens. This isn't the frame that you want for your security communications. And it isn't the way that you want your peers and your board members to see you. So instead, ensure that there is a consistency across the board, no pun intended, so that they are aware and learn to accept and expect it. Thus, when something changes organizationally and these briefings or updates aren't happening anymore, the first reaction of the board is going to be, what happened to Sean? What happened to Deep? And what happened to, I feel less connected to what's happening on the business side of our risk management processes.
Thank you very much, Sean. That was great. We've got another excellent question in the Q&A, so I'm gonna jump to that, I think, and then we'll move to the final question. Given the growth of cyber warfare, how could tech leadership engage the board, if they should indeed engage the board, to help influence cyber insurers to offer more protection against state-sponsored cyber attacks? And just to give a little bit of flavor and backdrop to that, cyber insurance costs have gone through the roof in the last year or so, really in the last 6 months in particular. And I think part of the reason for that is A, the increased number of attacks, and B, I think a better understanding from the actuaries on what the actual cyber risk is of the company that they're underwriting. So they're getting cleverer at understanding that. And they use the external risk surface as a mechanism for measuring how to underwrite that cyber insurance. So, and we've had a number of discussions on this, both actually at Guidewire, where we own one of the biggest companies in that space, and at Zscaler. Maybe Alex, do you want to start on that one? And just when you think about cyber insurance and you think about how to engage the board in that discussion, as a tech leader, what do you tell them?
Yeah, cyber insurance used to be the answer, right? Oh, well, we have insurance, we're covered. Yeah. And over time, it was interesting to watch, especially the ransomware events. And there's a theory floating around that one of the major insurance companies was breached so that the bad guys could understand who had insurance and would therefore pay the ransom. And so, it's this cat and mouse. The bad guys go where the money's at. And the real question or the real answer is insurance is really an after the fact. But how do you continue operations? How do you continue running your business regardless of insurance? And that's
100%.
where, yeah, I mean, that's where I think, we depend upon insurance. And insurance is one of those things that non-technical board members fully understand and get. And every company on the planet has. Board members have their own special type of insurance
That's true too.
for decisions they make. And so they understand that. But it's really, really important that, the board members focus more on how do we make sure we don't need to use the insurance.
100%
So that's
agree.
kind of how I look at it.
Yeah, no, I in one of my other companies, we were very focused on ransomware avoidance, and there's a much, you need both strategies. I think you need insurance for the unknown anyway, but for things that are known with mitigants, I think the mitigation is actually a much smarter strategy to adopt. Right, Sean or Deepan, you can have the last word on that, whoever wants to. Do you want to take that, Deepan?
Sure. Yeah. So in fact, it's related to what Alex was saying on the ransomware front. We've actually seen more than 5 different gangs, ransomware gangs. Once they're in your environment, they're in your environment for days, weeks, months at times. And they will figure out whether your organization has a cyber insurance. What is your coverage limit? And based on those, that as well as your financial statements, based on that, they will come up with that ransom amount, right? So they will try to make sure you cap out on your insurance limit, right? And you are able to actually pay the ransom that is being demanded. But completely agreed. I mean, having that as a backup policy to help you get out of those situations is great, but unless you have that strong security architecture in place to mitigate those kind of events, you will keep getting hit by that over and over again, because they've fingerprinted your environment. They will know how to come back in even after they hit you once, right? So every few months or years, you will see 1 or 2 of those attacks happening. That's where the mitigation is more important.
Hey, Andy, I'd like to address one other thing in this question. And it specifically mentions state-sponsored. And I think all of your cyber insurance policies specifically exclude any type of state-sponsored warfare. And one of the things that I educated my board on the last time I spoke to them was that cyber warfare is the 5th domain. And there are no cyber norms, right? There's no norms of how you conduct this warfare. All governments are doing it. And unfortunately, it's the world that we live in. It's almost the proxy for physical wars, as ironic as that sounds. But I don't know that we'll ever be able to get cyber insurance for state-sponsored attacks. Because in this war, all of our companies are on the front line, whether we like it or not, because it's a digital world. There are no boundaries. And it is the new reality that we have to live with.
I think, to be frank, Alex, I mean, that's honestly, I think, the most salient point in the entire panel. So thanks for jumping in there. I honestly think, when I think about my old job, like as CTO of UBS or Bank of America, and I think about what could I do to build insurance with technology so that I didn't have to pull the trigger on the cyber insurance or defend against state-sponsored, I would actually use zero trust, because by reducing the risk surface area, my probability of being attacked is reduced, and that is insurance. And so I think that's a really, really good point that you just made, and we'll maybe develop that a bit more from a story perspective for Christopher, as a white paper even. I think that's a really, really fantastic point. Okie doke. Well, thank you very much for your time, your insights, and your knowledge and experience to Alex, Deepan, and Sean. And Sean, I'll turn it over to you to close us out. Thank you very much.